Good afternoon. I'll be talking with you today about Troy, chapter 2, coming from our book, We the People. If you please follow along, I'm in chapter 2 on page 27. We're going to be talking specifically about the founding of our Constitution. I certainly hope that all of you already recognize that the person who is most responsible for the Constitution would be James Madison, our fourth president. He is known as the father of the Constitution, as Thomas Jefferson is known as the father of the Declaration of Independence. There are many other people that went into the writing of the Constitution. We'll talk about some of those. But again, we want to talk about the basic frameworks of the Constitution. Turning on over to page 29, you can see key concepts. There, I think you should go over each one of those concepts, make sure you're familiar with that from the work of political philosophers, which we're going to talk about in just a few moments. The Constitution, the checks and balances, British colonial rule. We're going to talk about the country's first founding documents, the Articles of Confederation and its weaknesses. Then, of course, we're going to talk about the new Constitution, which actually was ratified in 1789, but started in 1787. And of course, what that Constitution brings us to our political system in the United States that we have today. And of course, we all recognize that if it was not for a substantial and a promise of a Bill of Rights, then we would not have the Constitution. That was very, very much a paramount ideology for our founders. And then, of course, we're going to talk about how to amend the Constitution and what it means to us in the 21st century today. Let's talk about those political philosophers that helped our founders there on page 29. You can see there's two that are listed there on page 29. We're going to talk specifically about John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Let's talk about Hobbes. Hobbes believed in the social contract. Basically what the social contract is where once you enter into, you being a citizen, enter into an agreement with the sovereign being the king or government, then you could not get out of that contract. That's what Thomas Hobbes believed. Now, that ideology was radical back in his time in the 1600s. Quite frankly, because the king had total control. We learned in last chapter about totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And we understand that there are two different types of monarchies, a constitutional monarchy and just a regular monarchy where they have total control. A constitutional monarchy is very much like what they have in Great Britain today, where there are limitations on the power of the sovereign. But in those days, in the 1600s, it was radical to even think of thoughts like this, that the monarch, who was generally given his rights by divine providence or divine right, that means that our maker God it basically said that you were the king because God made you the king. And in these days, people became a little more democratic in thought. And Thomas Hobbes was one of the first people to say, it's not right. We need to think of a different way to govern. And part of that way to govern is the governed, the people. Of course, they have that obligation. They have that right that they can enter freely into a contract with the sovereign, the king. But once you enter into it, it's a done deal. And that's where it becomes a little tricky, because once you enter into the sovereign, with the agreement with the sovereign, then, the sovereign can do pretty much whatever they want at that point. So you had a philosopher come along a little later on in the late 1600s, early 1700s, and his name was John Locke. John Locke is credited by many people to be instrumental with our founding fathers as they wrote the Constitution, because John Locke added to the social contract theory. John Locke basically said this. He said, if you enter into a contract with the sovereign, and the sovereign does not fulfill their end of the deal. In other words, protection, economic purposes, whatever those particular ideologies were for the social contract, then the citizenry had the ability to get out of that contract. And that was a radical change from Hobbes, because remember, Hobbes basically said once you into it, you can't get out of it. And what did Locke say? Locke said once you get into it, if the sovereign's not doing what they should do, then you can get out of it. That's radically different than where we are today. Radically different theories. And I think the founders of our and framers of our Constitution, they basically looked upon these different ideologies as things, if they were going to build a new government, that was the time to do it. And there are other different philosophers that played into this role too. I'm going to skip for just 1 second. I am going to talk about on page 30 Baron Montesquieu and the second treatise of civil government by Locke. You need to at least be familiar with that. But I do want to talk about, if you look on your handouts that you were given in class that also have been emailed to you, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes are both listed there as social contract. Machiavelli believed in the Roman Republic. He wanted to go back to a Roman Republic style of governance. If you look on the back of that page, you'll see Rousseau. Rousseau believed in representative government, where people vote for other people to govern for them. And then, of course, Montesquieu believed in separation of powers between an executive branch, which enforces the laws, and a legislative branch, which makes the laws, and, of course, a judicial branch that adjudicates the laws. So our judges, our Supreme Court. So I think it's very important that you go over those particular areas as we move forward. Now, moving on, and again, I'm going to try to make these sessions about 15 minutes. We may have to do 2 for this chapter because chapter 2 is so very important. But I think it's really important to understand why, on page 30, the narrow interests of political conflict shaped our first founding. I think it's important to understand that during British colonial rule, things were not always good. Mother England for the colonists was just that, Mother England. And our brethren in Great Britain in Parliament did not think that the upstart American colonists could, of course, govern themselves. And we, as being 3,000 plus miles away, thought we could as American colonists. And so just because of distance, you had these types of issues to go on. So I wanted to talk about the British and the atrocities that occurred during British colonial rule that led us to the formation of the Bill of Rights. Because you can almost look at every single Bill of Rights to say, the reason why we have a Bill of Rights is because of atrocities that occurred during British colonial rule. Because the government was taking advantage of the citizenry, because the citizenry had no real rights. Now, there are other documents that are important that we're going to talk about. The Articles of Confederation being one, which was our first governing body that really got us through the Revolutionary War and really into the late 1780s. But they saw that that document was very flawed. It did have some positive. It won the war, the Revolutionary War, and it did enable us to purchase what we know as our Midwestern states today of Ohio and Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So again, there was some positives that came about from the Articles of Confederation, which was our first governing document. But for the most part, I think it's important to know that when the framers came together in 1787 to discuss making amends for the Articles of Confederation, they looked at things in a different way. They said, well, let's try to start anew. And much like when you write a term paper, you know, sometimes we write papers in our courses in high school and college, and it seems like it's a great paper. And you get into the paper, get into writing, and you see it's just not that good. And you can't fix the problem. So sometimes you just have to tear it up and start all over again. And that's exactly what our framers did of the Constitution. They tore it up and they said, let's do something totally different, radically different. Now that scared off a lot of people. As a matter of fact, several delegations from several states basically walked out. But those that stayed, led by George Washington, who was the president of the Constitutional Convention, those that stayed made the greatest document ever, the United States Constitution. Now I do want to talk just a little bit about that, along with taxation and things like that. We've heard of the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, We know about the tea tax. All of those different taxes really burdened the American colonists because they didn't feel like they had proper representation. As a matter of fact, they had no representation in Parliament in Great Britain, and they were asking for that. I really don't think that the American colonists really wanted to separate from England, but when these taxes started hitting them in their pocketbooks, much like today with voting, we had issues. And even in the 1700s, people voted with their pocketbooks. So again, I think it's really important that we look at that we remember that our forefathers here believed in the premise of no taxation without representation, and that was an overriding theme to everything that we do. Now, I think it's important enough that I mention too, as I go through the Constitution in just a few moments, that the Constitution would not have been ratified. Ratified means approved, of course, had it not been for a promise of a future Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was not initially put into the Constitution, but those that were afraid that the government would have too much authority and grow too big and too powerful, and that it would not serve the needs of the people, well, that is why we have a Bill of Rights, because they knew it would not be ratified. People were scared. They got out of one monarchy, and now are they going to go into another? And I think it's important enough for you to understand that the Articles of Confederation was a loose, really non-binding agreement between 13 independent states. A confederation, i.e. Articles of Confederation. And we should take just a moment to talk about that. You have a confederation, which is where power rests within the states, but states come together for commonalities like economics and protection. Then you have a federal form of government. And federal form of government is where in which the state comes together for national government, but the centralized power, the most power and authority rests in the national government. So I wanted to talk about those types of things. I want to talk about those big personalities that we hear about in history books, all the way from John Hancock to some of our folks from South Carolina, John Rutledge, very important people, Edmund Burke, so many different people throughout the United States that were benefited, that we benefit from, I should say, because of their excellence and, of course, their determination to make this document work. And again, it was not, when it was ratified, it was not unanimous. As a matter of fact, the two largest states at that time, Virginia and New York, although in accordance with the Articles of Confederation, that 9 states had to ratify it, even though 9 states ratified it, the newly formed Congress did not want to initiate the document, the United States Constitution, until its 2 largest and most powerful states, New York and, of course, Virginia, ratified the document. So although there's always a struggle in our country, even today, with large states and small states, it's important enough that we recognize that fact too. So again, I want to take just a moment or two to go over the Constitution. You have that in your handout. The Constitution is made up of a preamble, and Article 1 is about the legislative branch, and you can see in Article 1 it talks about the makeup of the House and Senate, how elections are to be held, compensation, revenue, and all revenue must start, of course, in the House of Representatives, and their powers and limitations on powers as well. Article 2 is about the executive branch, the presidency, the vice president. It goes on to talk about civilian power and military power, the makeup of the cabinet, pardons and appointments. And we also want to talk about the State of the Union in there as well, and how the president can convene Congress. And that's a powerful check and balance that the president has. And of course, disqualifying events as well. And then, of course, the third article is the judicial branch, which is our judges and the judicial power. Judicial review, so very, very important for us as Americans, that the courts have the ability and power to overturn legislative acts and executive decisions by the executive branch. And then, of course, trial by juries, those types of things, how they are supposed to be conducted, and the formal definition of treason, which means you have to have 1 + 1, 2 people to be convicted of treason, have to be a witness against you. And that was a protection for people who during British colonial rules, if one person said that another person was committing treason, then they could be put in jail, due process, and those types of things. And then, of course, we're going to talk in Article 4 about the states, citizenship, how to admit new states, how each state must honor the laws of other states. And, of course, Article 5 is about the amendment process, and there are two ways to formally amend the Constitution. We're going to talk about deaths, the supremacy of our national government in Article 6, oaths of office, and in Article 7 we're going to talk about how the Constitution was basically ratified. I think those are really, really important. And then, of course, you have all of those signatures at the bottom from each particular state. Now, I would strongly suggest you look at the back of our book, go through some of these as we go through them as well. And then I do want to take just a few moments of time to talk about the 27 amendments to the Constitution. From our First Amendment, which most all of you are very familiar with, freedom of speech, press, assembly, petition, and religion. We'll talk some about those. You'll see that in the PowerPoints as well. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, the right for citizens to own weapons. The Third Amendment, quartering of troops in public homes. The Fourth Amendment, search and seizures and limitations on those search and seizures. The Fifth Amendment is what I call the Due Process Amendment, which is about trials and punishment to some degree and compensation. And then the Sixth Amendment, a right to a speedy trial and the confrontation of witnesses. The Seventh Amendment, a trial by jury in civil cases. The Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, the death penalty, those types of things. The Ninth Amendment is the construction of the Constitution, how it's made up and why. The 10th Amendment is the power belongs to the people, and not, if it doesn't belong or stated that it belongs to the state, then it belongs to the people. The 11th Amendment is about judicial limits. The 12th Amendment is choosing the president and vice president. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are, of course, known as the Civil War Amendments because the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment gave citizenship rights to former slaves. And the 15th Amendment said that former slaves had the right to vote because in that order they were able to do that. And then, of course, you have the 16th Amendment, which is the income tax. The government could have a tax based on people's incomes. The 17th Amendment is how senators are elected by popular vote, which is a change from our original Constitution, whereas the General Assemblies or legislatures of each state elected senators. Then, of course, the 18th Amendment abolished the sale of alcohol. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. The 20th Amendment was about the president and congressional terms. The 21st Amendment gave everyone that is 18 years old, repealed the 18th Amendment. I'm sorry about that. I'm getting ahead of myself. Repealed the 18th Amendment, which repealed prohibition. The 22nd Amendment limited the president to 2 consecutive terms. The 23rd Amendment was a presidential vote for the District of Columbia. In other words, the District of Columbia, our seat of government, did not have representation in Congress. And so they can at least have representatives that are non-voting representatives in Congress in both the House and they have 3 electoral votes in presidential elections. And then, of course, the 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes. The 25th Amendment came about after the assassination of John F. Kennedy and dealt specifically with how the president's succession plan for the presidency and presidential disabilities. And then, of course, the 26th Amendment set voting age for all federal elections at 18 years of age. And the 27th Amendment, just so you know this, was a recurring from one of the original Bill of Rights. It did not get passed back in the 1890s. And it is about limiting congressional pay raises. In other words, our pay raises for congressmen can't go into effect until after the next election, after they're voted on. So people can see whether they should vote for their representatives because they've given themselves a raise. So those are the amendments, all 27. And of course, that's an outline of the Constitution itself. Now I do, before we finish this portion of chapter 2, and we will have 2 different sections for chapter 2. on video. I did want to give you a timeline. You do have that as a handout as well. The timeline for the start of contributing factors that led to the American Revolution. As you can see, the French and Indian War gave Americans confidence in their military well-being from 1754 to 1763. That is also where George Washington got his start. You can look in your history book to read about that. The Albany Plan, which was an original plan by Benjamin Franklin to bring the colonists together to form basically a working colonial government without any authority, just to come together to talk about issues that are related to the French and Indian War, British governance, and those types of things. The Intolerable Acts occurred in 1865 or 1765. The Stamp Act in 1765. The Stamp Act Congress in 1765. In other words, the British, they wanted to recoup their money for helping the American colonists, and of course that didn't sit too well with the Americans. We were British subjects. We didn't feel like we should be paying taxes for of course the war that occurred, which Great Britain was earning great wealth off of the colonies at that time, the future United States. Then, of course, you had the First Continental Congress come into effect in 1774, where the people, representatives from almost all of the colonies came together to say, we've got to do something. We've got to do something. We need to talk about it. And that's all it was talk. They basically sent a letter to the King of England and said, hey, we want representation. We don't think this is fair. Some things did change, but not a lot. And then, of course, you had the Battle of Lexington and Concord in 1775. And, of course, we all know that the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776 in Philadelphia, which came from the Second Continental Congress. And then, of course, we got through the war, and the Articles of Confederation led us, our first governing document in 1777, got us through the war. And then, of course, as a young fledgling nation, things happened. And as all things go on, we had Shays' Rebellion, where a group of veterans of the Revolutionary War who weren't getting compensated, their land and holdings were fixing to be taxed by the new government in Massachusetts. And they said no, and they were going to storm garrisons and whatnot, and that got put down in a hurry. But that was a catalyst to say we need to do something different. We need to look at what we do differently and have a different governmental system. And so then you had the Constitutional Convention begin in 1787, which led to the ratification of the U.S. Constitution in 1788. Of course, the Annapolis Convention, which came about because of these different issues that were going on at that time in 1785. And of course, the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, which formally occurred from 1787 until 1790. So I think it's really important that we understand and know those types of things. We also need to know about the Great Compromise, which was how representation would be chosen. We know about the Virginia Plan, which was large states wanted representation to be based solely upon their size and the amount of wealth they had. The smaller states were known as the New Jersey Plan, which small states wanted equal representation. The Great Compromise came about with the Three-Fifths Amendment. Three-Fifths Amendment is really something that we should all be very, very aware of, where unfortunately in those days they couldn't come up with a compromise over how to count enslaved African Americans. So what they did is the compromise was they would count each slave as 3/5 of a person, which is terrible, but that is what they came up with in those days. Of course, all of that was overturned with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, as we've already talked about. But compromise did have to happen. So the Great Compromise includes the Three-Fifths Compromise, the New Jersey Plan, the Virginia Plan, and of course, that plan together is known as the Connecticut Compromise, which later became known as, of course, the Great Compromise. So again, just as long as you know, the Connecticut Compromise was a melding of the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. So what did we end up with? We ended up with a bicameral type of governmental system with two houses, the Senate, which serves 6-year terms, a senator has to be 35 years of age, and they were originally selected. They were originally selected by the legislatures of each state, 2 from each state, no matter what your size was. And then, of course, we have a House of Representatives, the lower chamber, and there it's based on representation. And that is where the 3/5 compromise came in, of course, until 1865. And it's important that you know those things. And we had two different areas that you need to be aware of here. You need to be aware that everyone wasn't in favor of this new Constitution. Some people, known as the Anti-Federalists, were not in favor of ratification of the Constitution. Those people that were in favor of ratification of the Constitution were called the Federalists. That was really important to them. And you do need to understand this. Probably the Constitution would not have been passed at all had there not been a promise to ban slavery for 20 years from the ratification date. So from 1788 until 1808, 20 years, that there would be no legislation banning slavery. And that was a compromise that was made so that the document could be ratified. And of course, we understand that ratification means approval. And just so you know, I don't think I mentioned this, but the Articles of Confederation was a unicameral government, and it was based on equal representation. And so you can see where the larger states didn't like that, but the smaller states did. And then, of course, when we went to the current form of government we have today, the smaller states, they thought that was a good portion for them to have equal representation in one of our branches of government, or one of our houses of government. People I think you should know throughout this chapter is, of course, George Washington, very important figure, not only our first president, but president of the Constitutional Convention. Thomas Jefferson, our third president, author of the Declaration of Independence. He was not available during the time in which the U.S. Constitution was ratified. He was over in France at that time. James Madison, the father of the United States Constitution, our fourth president, really an outstanding intellectual. John Rutledge from here in South Carolina, who played an integral part in the ratification process. Alexander Hamilton, you probably know him from the $10 bill, one of our first department heads, and he was instrumental in the development of our economic system that we have. George Mason, really great thinker of the time that helped shape the Constitution. Gouverneur Morris, another great thinker of the time that helped shape our Constitution. Of course, and Robert Sherman. Those three men outside of James Madison were instrumental in the formation of the Constitution and how it's made and realistically what we developed into today. And then, of course, we don't even have to talk about Benjamin Franklin. He was there. He was the oldest delegate there, and he did so much to make sure that the ratification process went through, and it wasn't smooth, and everyone wasn't in favor. It wasn't unanimous, but at the end of the day, the document has been tested through time and remains the greatest document in the world today for any type of government overview, and that's the United States Constitution. So that's going to bring us an end to this particular segment. I will go over some more possibly in chapter 2 and 3 that will be important. But again, I hope this has been somewhat enlightening to you in a very short period of time. But I did want to give you some overviews about what's important in chapter 2. Thank you.